They called her the float nurse. No name, no unit, no standing. Just the woman who showed up to clean bays and empty basins and take the assignments nobody else wanted at a failing South Side clinic, where the attending physician had been right about everything for 32 years and wasn't about to stop now. She had been invisible for 4 months. She had worked hard at it. Then a building exploded 3 blocks away, and the patient started coming through the door, and something inside her that she had spent 3 years burying woke up. Cold, precise, and impossible to ignore. She was not just a nurse. The operators who arrived in the middle of the chaos knew exactly who she was. One word told the whole room. One word that she had not heard in 3 years. One word she had been running from since the night she made a decision in a burning valley in Syria and left part of herself there. This is the story of what happens when the person you've been hiding from yourself walks back through the door. If you're watching this to the end, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and welcome to Silent Badge's Stories, where the quietest person in the room always has the most extraordinary past. She was 3 patients into a 10-hour shift when Dr. Marcus Aldridge passed her in the hallway and said, without looking up, "Float. Bay 3 needs a dressing change. When you're done, restock the procedure cart." He turned the corner before she could respond. He had not said her name. He never said her name. She had introduced herself 4 times in 4 months, and it had not mattered. Reese Calloway pulled the chart from the rack outside Bay 3 and went to work. St. Catherine's Community Clinic stood on West Garfield, on the south side, wedged between a check-cashing store and a laundromat. The building had been a hardware store before the neighborhood changed. The renovation that followed was partial and perpetually unfinished. The waiting room had 42 mismatched chairs. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that was background noise at hour 1 and became, by hour 6, a physical sensation behind the eyes. The clinic served a population that had few other options, 3 times the citywide average for uninsured residents. The funding model assumed 30 patients per shift. The reality was 60. Dr. Aldridge had been the attending physician here for 9 years. He ran the clinic the way certain people ran small kingdoms, with complete confidence and selective attention. He was 63, silver-haired, and possessed of the certainty that accumulates in men who have operated without meaningful challenge for long enough that the absence of challenge starts to feel like evidence of being right. Reese had been here 4 months. She had taken the float position because floats were invisible by design. They belonged to no unit, attended no meetings, had no standing obligations beyond the shift itself. They showed up, plugged gaps, and disappeared at the end without anyone noting the absence. 4 months ago, invisible had seemed like exactly what she needed. She had not anticipated caring about the patients. The patient in Bay 3 was Gloria Reyes, 47, diabetic, a non-healing wound on her lower left leg from a home injury 2 weeks prior. Someone had wrapped it tight and wrong, and she'd kept it that way until the skin at the margins started doing things that scared her daughter into driving. Reese removed the old dressing layer by layer, margins examined with gloves and light, suppuration at the south edge, macerated tissue, a temperature differential between wound base and surrounding skin. She irrigated with saline, packed correctly, re-wrapped with proper tension, measured the wound margins with a ruler, and noted them in the chart with a date stamp. Gloria watched her work with the evaluating look of a woman who had been through enough medical encounters to know the difference between being handled and being helped. "You're the one who did my last dressing, too," she said. 3 weeks ago, yes. It's smaller now. It's getting there." Reese smoothed the last strip of tape. "Keep weight off it. Follow up in 48 hours. Ask for me specifically." Gloria studied her. "Where'd you learn to do all that so fast?" "Nursing school." Technically true. Nursing school had taught her wound assessment and dressing protocol, the speed, the precision, the particular economy of her movements. The way her hands settled into each step, as if they had done this 1,000 times in conditions far less favorable than a well-lit bay, that had come from somewhere else entirely. She moved back to the floor. Linda, the charge nurse, managed the board with the competence of someone who had made peace with the gap between what the work required and what the work had. "Board's backed up," Linda said without looking away from her screen. "Bay 7 got a recheck flag." "I flagged it." "I know. He crossed it out." "I know," Reese said. "I'm going back in." Linda's voice dropped half a register. "He's not going to change his assessment before round. His SAT is at 91. Linda looked at her then, just for a second. The look of a woman who had been here long enough to know that being right and being heard were different problems with different solutions, and only one of them was hers to manage. Reese went to Bay 7 anyway. Earl Briggs was a retired CTA transit operator, 71 years old, large in the way of men who had spent decades at physical work and whose bodies still carried the memory of it. He had come in at 2 in the afternoon with what he called a chest cold that had gotten stubborn. His wife Della had dropped him off and gone across the street to the laundromat for coffee, intending to return in 30 minutes. That was 2 hours ago. Reese picked up his wrist before speaking. Radial pulse, 108, thin and fast. She looked at his fingertips. The mottling had advanced since her initial assessment, spreading across the distal phalanges, a dull, grayish purple that had nothing to do with COPD and everything to do with the body directing blood away from extremities it could no longer afford to maintain. Something moved in the back of her mind, a ghost of a memory she refused to let form. Different hands, different light, the same discoloration spreading upward toward the wrist. She broke it before it surfaced. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I want to check your SAT again." The probe read 91%, down 3 points from admission. His blood pressure, 92/60. Mean arterial pressure, 70, falling. She went to the nurse's station and flagged his chart a second time. She added specifics. MAP 70 declining, peripheral mottling advancing. Recommend immediate IV access. Blood cultures, lactic acid, CBC with differential, sepsis protocol initiation. Then she found Aldridge. He was at the back workstation with his coffee and a pharmaceutical rep's printout, doing 2 things at once and fully invested in neither. "Bay 7, she said. "I've assessed Bay 7. His MAP is 70 and trending down. He's modeled to the mid-finger. Documented COPD, 30-year smoking history. This is not COPD." She kept her voice level. "His presentation is septic. He needs a line, cultures, and lactic acid. If we wait until round, he deteriorates past easy transfer." Aldridge set down the printout. He turned to look at her with the slow patience of a man who has decided to demonstrate something through his demeanor alone. A man who has been challenged by people he outranked for long enough that the demonstration has become reflexive. "Nurse Calloway. Reese Calloway. I've told you 4 times. The pause was deliberate. "Nurse Calloway." He folded his hands. "I've been practicing emergency medicine for 32 years. You're a float nurse. When I require your diagnostic opinion, I will ask for it." He picked up the printout. "The procedure cart still needs restocking." 3 seconds at the back desk. Her hands were perfectly still. They were always still when the situation needed her to come apart. 6 years of training had built something over the reflex, not by suppression but by construction. Muscle memory that ran deeper than whatever was happening in her chest right now. She went back to Bay 7. The IV went in on the first attempt. Needle seated before Earl had fully registered it. Blood drawn, tubes labeled. The orders she was not authorized to write went on a separate card, placed on the chart where Aldridge would find it. Then she picked up the direct transfer line and called County General. She was on hold, standing at the window in Bay 7, watching the November sky go flat and gray over the south side rooftops, when the floor moved. Not a truck. Not the building's ancient HVAC. A pressure wave. Low frequency, subsonic, the kind that traveled through steel-reinforced concrete and arrived in her chest as a deep, dull percussion a full half-second before her ears processed what had caused it. She knew this feeling. She had felt it in 3 countries, and it had never once meant nothing. The window glass rattled in its frame. The pendant light above Earl's bed swung 2 inches. From the waiting room came a collective sound, a sharp gasp, a child crying, the crash of something falling from the reception desk. Reese hung up the phone. She crossed to the window in 4 steps. 3 blocks south, above the flat roof lines of 2 apartment buildings, a column of smoke was climbing into the November sky. Dense at the base, black shot through with orange at the source. The orange said structural fuel. The smoke's shape said the collapse had been sudden, and the debris field was wide. The secondary wave arrived 9 seconds after the first. Lower register, longer duration. The hallway lights blinked twice and steadied. From the street, sirens, 1, then 3, then too many to count separately. Reese pressed 2 fingers to her own wrist. 56 beats per minute. Her heart rate had dropped the moment the wave arrived. Not spiked, dropped. That was the way it had always worked. The way she was made or had made herself through years in conditions where spiking was not useful. The world went sideways, and something in her stepped back from reaction into the cold arithmetic of what happens next. She turned from the window. Blast radius, accessible from the smoke column's diameter. Patient count, estimable from the building density 3 blocks south. Time to first casualties, not enough. Given that the clinic was already at capacity, understaffed by half, running low on 3 key supplies, and led by a physician whose last mass casualty training she suspected had been a box checked in 1998. She looked at Earl Briggs. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I'm going to get you squared away. Things are going to get loud out there. Stay exactly where you are." He looked at her hands, still and flat on the bedrail. "Was that an explosion?" "Yes. You've been in one before," he said. Not a question. She went to find the supply cart. The first patient arrived 11 minutes after the explosion. She came through the front door on her own 2 legs, which was the only reason she'd made it. She had been 2 blocks away when the building went, and the blast wave had thrown her sideways into a parked car. Her left shoulder was dislocated, the deltoid pushed visibly wrong under her shirt. Both ears were bleeding. She was holding her arm against her body with the careful deliberateness of someone who had stopped feeling it and was now managing it mechanically. Reese intercepted her before Linda reached the intake desk. "Name," Reese said, walking her toward the wall. "Diane. Diane Okafor." "Diane. I see the shoulder. Any head injury you're aware of?" "I don't. There was a sound and then I was on the ground." "Did you hit your head when you fell?" "Maybe. I don't know. Look at my eyes." 2 fingers held up. "Track these for me." The woman tracked them. Pupils equal, reactive, no lag, face symmetric, speech clear and formed in complete sentences. The ear bleeding was tympanic membrane rupture, both sides, painful, weeks of ringing, not immediately dangerous. "You're going to be okay," Reese said. "The shoulder is going to hurt until a doctor reduces it. The ears will ring. Both of those are temporary." She settled Diane into the last open chair and went back to the entrance. The street outside had transformed in 11 minutes. Cars had stopped in both directions. People were moving toward the smoke column with the specific pull that disaster exerts, some to help, some to watch, most caught between the two without having decided. She counted 3 more people heading toward the clinic from the north. A man sat on the curb with his head between his knees. A woman crouched beside him. A child stood in the center of the sidewalk, staring straight up at the smoke. The air smelled like burning plastic, pulverized concrete, and under both, something sharper, more specific, accelerant, butyl-based, residential gas main, shut off too slow, ignition too fast. She went back inside. "Linda," she said, keeping her voice even and quiet. "We're going to receive mass casualties. Call 911. Request a full mass casualty response. Not fire and rescue only, full MCR. Tell them St. Catherine's is the nearest medical facility and we are actively receiving. Linda looked at her. Dr. Aldridge needs to authorize. That's why I need him at the front desk in the next 40 seconds, please. Aldridge emerged from the back hallway at his habitual pace, unhurried, tablet in hand, moving with the measured authority of a man who had not felt the pressure wave or had felt it and categorized it as not his department. He looked at Diane with her dislocated shoulder. He looked at the front door. He looked at Reese. "What's the situation?" he said. "Structural explosion 3 blocks south. Multi-story residential collapse based on the smoke volume. I've done a street assessment. Minimum 15 to 20 walking wounded visible from the entrance. And based on building density in that direction, we will receive critical patients. I need you to authorize mass casualty protocol." Aldridge looked at the door again. He looked at Diane. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said. "Linda, start an intake form. We'll manage as they come in." He moved toward Diane. Reese stood in the corridor for 2 seconds. Getting ahead was exactly what was required. She went to the supply room. Moving fast and without announcement, Reese pulled everything she could locate and transport. Trauma dressings, the tourniquet stock from the 3rd shelf behind the blood pressure cuffs, 2 airway kits. The pediatric crash cart she had noticed 3 weeks ago was fully stocked and had filed away in a mental location she had not fully acknowledged until this moment. 2 IV carts went into the hallway. The spare oxygen concentrator came out of back storage. The marker from Linda's desk went into her pocket. A secondary triage area took shape in the waiting room's left corner. Chairs moved to create lanes, IV carts labeled by priority, airway kits positioned closest to the door. Deja, the monitoring tech, 22 years old, first month on the floor, appeared in the hallway holding a pulse oximeter with an expression that had not yet found a category for what it was watching. "What do you need me to do?" Deja asked. "Vitals on every new arrival. Write them on the patient's arm in this marker. Sat, pulse, blood pressure if you have the time. Don't wait for the chart system." Deja looked at the marker, at the triage setup. She nodded twice, fast, and went to the door. The door opened. 6 people came through, then 4 more behind them. Reese moved. Start triage. Airway, breathing, circulation, mental status. 60 seconds per patient, no lingering. Red wristband for immediate. Yellow for delayed. Green for minimal. She moved through the room in under 3 minutes, touching each person, making the call, moving on. Red, the man with burns on both forearms who was breathing too fast on the right side. Yellow, the woman with the lacerated scalp and ringing ears but stable vitals. Green, the construction worker covered in structural dust who was shaking badly but ambulatory and could state his own name without pausing. With the man who had the red wristband, Reese knelt. She listened to his chest without a stethoscope, leaned in, pressed her ear to his right side, heard the reduced movement of air, felt the laboring of the intercostals. She straightened and put 2 fingers at his radial pulse, going thin. His trachea was not quite midline. She watched it for 3 seconds. Then she watched it shift. That was not ambiguous. "Dr. Aldridge," she said from across the room, her voice flat and carrying. "I need you here, right now." Aldridge was 8 feet away with the lacerated scalp patient, working through the intake process at the pace of a man who had not yet calibrated to the current tempo. He looked over. 1 moment. The trachea shifted further. 1 centimeter. The radial pulse was almost gone. She was already opening the needle decompression kit. Aldridge arrived beside her. "What are you doing?" "Tension pneumothorax." She swabbed the site. Iodine, 30 seconds, no time for betadine. 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. Tracheal deviation right. He's got less than 3 minutes. "Nurse Calloway, you are not Dr. Aldridge." She looked at him once, directly, with the particular quality of attention that does not raise its voice, because it does not need to. "Do you want to do this, or do you want to watch me do it?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as neither of them could afford. He stepped back. She inserted the 14-gauge angiocath at 90 degrees to the chest wall. The hiss of escaping trapped air was immediate and audible in the room. The man's chest rose on the right side. His trachea shifted back to midline. He drew a full breath, then another. The gray color around his mouth began to recede. "Sat's coming up," Deja said from behind her. 92, 94. Reese secured the catheter. She looked at Deja. "Watch his chest. If the left side stops moving, you come get me immediately." She stood. Behind her, she could feel Aldridge doing the assessment he should have done before, listening to the man's chest, now that there was something to hear, noting the bilateral movement, nodding to himself in the private way of a man reprocessing an outcome. She didn't watch. She went to the front of the room. More patients coming through the door now. A woman with burns across her right arm, partially supported by a teenager who was supporting himself on equal parts adrenaline and terror. A man walking on one leg with a stranger's arm around his shoulders. Two children, one crying, one completely silent in the specific way that was more concerning than the crying. She assessed them in order, color-coded them, moved on. She was reaching for the next wristband when a man came through the door carrying a child. The girl was 8, maybe 9, eyes open, not unconscious, but with the particular limpness of a body retreating from something it cannot process. The shock response, the inward collapse that looked like stillness and was actually everything wrong at once. Her right upper quadrant, just below the costal margin, was soaked through her shirt. Penetrating injury. Object removed or dislodged already. Active bleeding, now slowing. Slowing was either controlled or was the body running out. "Side bay," Reese said to the man holding her. "Follow me, right now." She took the girl to the exam table, transferred weight carefully, started talking before the child could ask. "What's your name?" "Amara," barely audible. "Amara, I have you. You're in a clinic and you're safe. I need you to stay still for me." "Is my dad here?" "Right outside the door." She was cutting the shirt. The wound was 2 centimeters, jagged-edged, subcostal, rebar or a similar object, moving fast through a narrow trajectory. No object in situ. The bleeding was oozing, not pulsing, not arterial, but deep and consistent, and a child's body could not afford to lose much more volume. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, pressing straight down, counting under her breath. 1001, 1002. 3 full minutes of direct pressure, the kaolin fiber matrix activating against the blood. Amara cried out once, sharp, and then went quiet, and looked at Reese with enormous brown eyes. "You're brave," Reese said. She did not let go of the packing. "You are so brave. 3 more minutes." "Does it hurt you?" Amara asked. "Doing this?" "No." "But you look sad." Reese held both hands steady on the dressing. "Focused looks like sad sometimes," she said. "I'm okay." When 3 minutes were up, the gauze had integrated and the bleeding had slowed to nearly nothing. She went to find Aldridge. The front door opened and 3 men came through. The first 2 were in flight suits. Air Force, AFSOC designation visible on the shoulder patches. The third was in tactical gear, plate carrier, helmet pushed back, subdued insignia on a chest tab she read from 15 feet away, without registering that she was reading it. All 3 carried medical kits, not standard issue. Non-standard kit on an AFSOC operator meant they had sourced their own or built their own, or had spent enough time in enough different situations that standard issue had stopped being a ceiling and become a starting point. Reese was checking the tension pneumo patient's catheter when the third man stopped. He stopped in the way that trained people stop. Not frozen, not startled, but fully paused with complete awareness. He scanned the room the way she had been taught to scan a room. Entry points, patient distribution, resource positions, threat vectors. He saw the colored tape on the patient's wrists. He saw the IV carts positioned by priority level. He saw the layout, immediate patients along the left windows, delayed in the center, minimal along the right wall. And she understood from 15 feet away that he recognized it. Not as something from a civilian emergency manual, as something he had seen in practice. His gaze moved across the room. It found her. He looked at her the way someone looks at a face that does not match its context, a face known from somewhere so far removed that the recognition runs twice before trusting itself. His gaze dropped to her gloves, to the positioning of her hands, to the hemostatic packing visible through the open door of the side bay. He was still for 10 seconds. Then he crossed the waiting room toward her. She turned back to the patient, checking the catheter seal, confirming bilateral chest rise. When she heard him stop 3 feet behind her, she knew the footsteps, not consciously. Deeper than conscious. The stride length and weight distribution, and the particular way the heel met the linoleum. She had heard those footsteps in Syria, in Erbil, in the corridor of a C-130 at altitude with the ramp down and the wind coming through from 40,000 feet below. She kept her hands on the patient. Master Sergeant Caleb Torres, callsign Wraith, 38th Rescue Squadron, Air Force Special Operations Command, drew one slow breath. Then he said it. Shepherd. The word was quiet, barely louder than the nearest monitor. It did not need to be loud. It had a frequency that bypassed ambient noise entirely, arriving somewhere deeper than the ears before the ears had caught up to it. Reese's hands went still on the patient's chest. Not trembling. Still. The stillness of someone who has been found somewhere they did not intend to be found and is making in real time a decision about what to do next. She checked the catheter seal, sat reading from Deja, 95, steady. Chest rise, unlabored, bilateral, equal. Then she stood and turned around. Torres was exactly as she remembered. 37, dark-haired, the kind of build that people called lean until they were standing next to it and understood it wasn't lean at all. There was a scar through his left eyebrow that was newer than her memory of his face. He had the stillness of someone who had spent years in very loud places and had learned stillness was the most useful tool. He looked at her for 3 seconds. "What are you doing in Chicago?" he said. "In scrubs. Float nurse." Her voice was flat. "St. Catherine's Community Clinic." "How long?" "4 months." A pause. "Shepherd." "Not now, Torres." Behind her, the door opened again. More patients. A woman on a door panel carried by 2 teenagers who had stripped it from a frame somewhere on the street. A man walking on one leg. A child with burns on her forearms and a face that had gone very, very still. Reese turned back to the room. She moved. 3 years earlier, in northwestern Syria, a mission had a 10-minute extraction window and 4 casualties. 1 bird. The critical patient, Sergeant First Class Reyes, gunshot wound to the chest seal applied, going gray from the extremities outward, would not survive the ground transfer to the secondary LZ. He needed the bird immediately. His weight committed the aircraft's capacity. 2 other casualties were serious but ambulatory. They would load with Reyes. That left Devon Marsh. Devon had taken a blast fragment to his right leg on the approach. He was moving, but slowing, with the specific deceleration of someone who had more blood on the outside than the inside, and hadn't quite done the math on how long that remained viable. Comms had said the secondary bird was 18 minutes out. The extraction window was 10. Devon had looked at her with gray eyes that were calm and specific and entirely final. "Take Reyes," he said. "Take the walkers. I'll call the secondary in." Devon. Shepherd. Once. Not resigned. Just factual. "You know the math." She had known the math. She had taken her casualties and boarded her bird. The secondary bird was delayed by a threat vector she hadn't been briefed on, and Devon Marsh went off comms at 0412, and she learned the rest at Incirlik at 0600 with cold coffee and the specific sound of wind through a building that had not been designed for sound. Resignation came 6 weeks later. A float nurse on the south side of Chicago, where she had no name worth knowing, and no decisions that cost anyone their life, and no one who would notice when she disappeared at the end of the shift. She was working the burn patient's arm, silver-impregnated dressings, Torres's kit, better than anything in the clinic, when Linda appeared at her shoulder. "County EMS is 2 minutes out," Linda said. "Amara's pressure is holding. Tell them pediatric priority 1, penetrating abdominal trauma with hemostatic packing. The clock on the packing starts from application, not arrival. She needs an OR." "Already told them," Linda said. Reese looked at her. Linda's face was composed and steady, and carried the specific look of someone who had been watching carefully for a long time, and had finally made a decision about what they were watching. "This isn't nursing school," Linda said. "No." "Then what is it?" Reese pressed the last dressing flat. "The same thing," she said. "Different classroom." She turned back to Torres. He was at the supply cart, restocking what they had used, doing it correctly without being shown where anything was kept. The 2 flight-suited operators had integrated into the floor's workflow as if they had always been there, one monitoring the tension pneumo patient, one in Earl Briggs's bay, running the sepsis protocol she had ordered, and left. "How many operators did you bring?" she asked. 2 plus me, and a flight surgeon working triage outside. "I need the flight surgeon in here." He spoke into his comms. The County General EMS team came through the door 2 minutes later. 2 paramedics, a gurney. Reese met them at the entrance and gave the handoff in 45 seconds. Pediatric, 9 years old, penetrating subcostal trauma, hemostatic packing applied, vitals documented on chart, father accompanying, no known allergies. Clock has been running 19 minutes. They loaded Amara in 3 minutes. She stood at the door and watched the ambulance pull away. The smoke column was smaller now. The fire department had gotten water on it. The street was emergency vehicles and yellow tape, and the particular controlled chaos of a disaster in its second hour. She felt Torres standing behind her. "She's going to make it," he said. "I know." "How?" "Because I did it right." She turned back to the clinic. Inside, the room had settled into its working rhythm. Multiple lanes running simultaneously, monitors steady, the flight surgeon now integrating into the delayed care patients. The floor was moving. Aldridge was at the intake desk. He looked up when she crossed the room. He said nothing. But he looked at her differently than he had 4 months ago, and differently than he had 1 hour ago. And she understood that whatever he had believed about float nurses, about women who showed up in blue scrubs and disappeared at the end of shifts and had no authority to tell him what a patient needed, was in the process of being revised at a cellular level. Torres was still at the supply cart. "How did you find this clinic?" she said. "Nearest facility map. We found the collapse, not you." He looked at her. "The map didn't tell me who worked here." She pulled a fresh pair of gloves. "How many people know you saw me?" "My 2 operators, the flight surgeon," he paused, "and everyone in this waiting room." She looked at the room. 31 patients triaged. 1 child alive, who had been 2 decisions away from not being alive. 1 tension pneumo stabilized in the correct space at the correct angle at the correct moment. Her hands had known what to do. Devon had said once that the job stayed in your hands, not in your head, where you could argue with it, reconsider it, lock it away in a box with a lid. In your hands, where it waited. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. Torres was watching her. "Are you coming back?" he said. Reese pressed the gloves flat. The room around her, the triage lanes, the IV carts labeled by priority. The patients moving through the system she had built in 20 minutes from what the clinic had and what Torres's kit had given her. Looked nothing like it had 2 hours ago. Aldridge was at the intake desk, processing a patient methodically, working within the lanes she had created without comment. There was no answer for Torres. But the word shepherd was still in the air of the waiting room, quiet and unaddressed, and the room had not yet stopped waiting on it. Nobody moved, not Deja with the pulse oximeter, not Linda at the intake desk, Not the two flight-suited operators who had frozen mid-task, not even the tension pneumo patient, who had been monitoring his own survival from the gurney with the detached focus of someone who had extended the habit to everything around him. The word shepherd was in the air, and the room did not know what to do with it. Reese did. She turned back to the burn patient's dressings. Patricia, 43, had been in the building's lobby when it went. The kind of person who survived because the lobby was load-bearing and the lobby held. The silver-impregnated dressings on her right arm needed securing at the proximal edges. Reese pressed them flat, taped them in 3 places, noted the time on the chart. "You're going to need these assessed again in 12 hours, she said. "When EMS gets you to county, tell them the dressings are already applied. Ask them not to remove them unless the surgeon specifically requests." Patricia was looking at her with the particular clarity that extreme pain and extreme relief could produce in equal measure. "That man said your name." "He said a word," Reese said. "Pain level, 1 to 10. 6, maybe 7. A pause. "Who are you?" "The nurse who dressed your arm." 7 or above, you ask for something. Torres had not moved from 6 feet behind her. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness the way she had always been able to. He was patient in the way that good operators were patient, not passive, but precise, waiting with intention that did not decay. He would not move on until she addressed it. She did not address it. She moved to the delayed care bay. The room was still very quiet behind her. She could feel it without looking. The specific stillness of a space waiting for an explanation that wasn't going to come. The way a room waited after something was said that changed it. She did not offer an explanation. 4 patients remained. Diane Okafor with the dislocated shoulder. 2 men with lacerations, 1 forearm, 1 across the palm. Harold Osei, 54, hypertensive, blast-induced tinnitus, blood pressure that had been climbing since she last checked and needed explanation. She worked through them. The shoulder reduction took 90 seconds. She positioned Diane with her arm at the correct angle, not the angle Aldridge would have chosen, the gentler one that took longer and involved less force, but produced less muscle trauma. Applied steady external rotation and felt the joint seat. Diane exhaled sharply and then, 2 seconds later, exhaled again with the different quality of a body part returning to where it was supposed to be. "That's it," Reese said. "The joint is back." Diane's eyes were wet. "It doesn't hurt." "It will. Tomorrow and the day after." Reese secured the sling she had fashioned from a triangular bandage. "Ice and elevation. No heavy lifting for 10 days. Follow up with your own doctor in 48 hours. You'll want imaging to confirm there's no associated fracture." "Okay." "You did great," Reese said. She moved to the first laceration. The forearm wound was 3 centimeters, clean-edged by some standard. Blast debris that had moved fast enough to cut cleanly rather than tear. She irrigated, checked for depth, confirmed no tendon involvement, and closed it in 4 simple interrupted sutures. The man whose arm it was, early 30s, still covered in plaster dust from wherever he had been when the building went, watched her hands with the rapt, slightly disconnected attention of someone who was processing the evening in real time and finding certain parts easier to absorb than others. "You've done this before," he said. "Yes." "You're very fast. The faster it's closed, the better the outcome." She tied off the last suture. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight? Someone who can watch you?" "My brother. He lives 2 blocks from here." "Good. Go there. Don't be alone." She moved to the palm laceration, longer wound, more complex, running obliquely across the thenar eminence in a way that needed close attention, deep enough to threaten the abductor pollicis brevis, shallow enough that she could close it without specialist involvement if she was careful. She was careful. 7 sutures, placed precisely, the needle angled correctly each time, the tissue approximated without excessive tension. When she was done, she dressed it and wrote the wound care instructions on a separate card. Then she went to Harold Osei. His blood pressure had climbed to 158/98. She found his medical card in his wallet. He carried it, had been carrying it since a hypertensive crisis 5 years ago had landed him in the emergency department, and the doctor there had told him to keep it with him always. He had not taken his morning medication. The stress of the explosion had done the rest. She found the correct medication in the clinic's standing supply, calculated the dose, administered it with Linda's countersign, and watched his pressure for 5 minutes while Deja held the cuff. It began to come down. "Breathe slow," Reese told him. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. The medication is working." He breathed. He was a large man, and he was shaking in the way people shook when the adrenaline started leaving the building without asking what it was going to leave behind. "My apartment is 2 blocks from the collapse," he said. "I know. Is it? I don't have information on the specific addresses." She held his wrist and counted, pulse still elevated but less ragged. "The fire department is on scene. Right now, the most useful thing you can do is keep your pressure down." He nodded. He breathed. She stayed with him until his pressure read 144/90. Still elevated, still worth watching, but no longer alarming. She went to find Aldridge. He was where she expected him, at the back of the clinic, in the hallway outside his office, watching the triage floor with his tablet lowered and his coffee untouched at the counter beside him. He had the expression of a man who had been standing in the same spot for a long time and was still constructing a category for what he was watching. "Dr. Aldridge," she said, "Earl Briggs needs his transfer authorized. MAP, under 70 for 90 minutes. Aldridge looked at her, not through her, at her, with the specific attention of someone who had changed the register of their focus and hadn't announced the change. "His last SAT was 93, he said. SAT alone doesn't tell the full story in early sepsis. His MAP is trending the wrong direction and he needs a higher level of care." A pause that lasted 3 seconds. "I'll authorize the transfer," he said. She waited. "That man who came in," Aldridge said. He held the coffee cup without drinking from it. "He called you something." "He called me a name I used to have." "Used to have?" "Shepherd," she said. It was a call sign. Aldridge looked at the triage floor, at the lanes she had created, at the IV carts positioned by priority level, at the patients moving through the system he had not designed and would not have designed. "A call sign," he said. "Authorize the Briggs transfer," she said. "Please." She walked back to the floor before he could ask the next question. Behind her, she heard him pick up the phone. Linda was waiting at the supply cart with a clipboard and the careful expression of someone who had been watching the night develop and had made several decisions about it. "The transfer request is going to County General?" Linda asked. "Dr. Aldridge just authorized it." Linda wrote something on the clipboard. "How long has Briggs been symptomatic?" "At least 6 hours from presentation, possibly longer before he came in." "You flagged it at hour 2?" "Yes." Linda wrote something else. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The flight surgeon arrived 90 seconds later. Her name tape read, Kessler. She stopped just inside the entrance and scanned the room with the 3-second assessment, entry points, patient distribution, resources, and then her gaze settled on Reese. Not recognition of a face, recognition of a methodology. "You set up this triage protocol," she said. "Yes. Combat modified. What we had available." Kessler looked at the tension pneumo patient who was breathing with both lungs because a decision had been made in a 3-minute window. She looked at the triage lanes, the IV carts, the systematic flow of patients through a system that had no civilian equivalent she could name by rote. "PJ training," she said. Not a question. Reese said nothing. Kessler looked at Torres. Torres said nothing. Kessler looked at her for 1 more second. Then she nodded once, made a decision with her face, and moved to the nearest patient. Questions were secondary. The work was what mattered. They both understood that. Outside, through the front windows, another vehicle had stopped. Not an ambulance, not fire support. A military staff car, black, blankly official. The driver was already opening the rear door. The person who stepped out wore a lieutenant colonel's uniform. Reese saw her from across the room. She turned back to Harold Osei's blood pressure. One more reading before she could move on. Her name was Sandra Vega, and she moved through the clinic entrance the way people moved when they were accustomed to arriving where the situation had already gotten complicated before they got there. She was 45, sharp-featured, with the service ribbons of someone who had been to several of the same places Reese had been, different missions, same general coordinates. Her expression ran a rapid assessment of the room, the same scan Reese had done 50 minutes ago, the same scan Torres had done when he came through the door. 3 seconds. Complete situational picture. She looked at the triage layout, colored tape on the patient's wrists, IV carts labeled by priority, positioned for flow, treatment lanes running left to right in order of urgency, a methodology that was not in any civilian emergency management manual. She found Torres. He nodded toward Reese. Vega crossed the room. She stopped 3 feet from Reese, who was documenting vitals on the tension pneumo patient, and did not look up. "Who set up this triage protocol?" Vega asked. "I did." Reese noted the latest reading, sat 96, steady, and moved to the next chart. "What protocol?" "Start, modified for available resources." "Modified how?" "Commercial hemostatic gauze substituted for combat field dressing. IV poles for lane separation. Surgical tape for the color system. We don't carry triage tags." Reese noted Harold Osei's blood pressure, 140/88, continuing to trend down. It worked. Vega was quiet for 3 seconds. "Torres," she said without looking away from Reese. "Ma'am." He was at her left shoulder. "Who is she?" "Staff Sergeant Reese Calloway, former, 38th Rescue Squadron, Hurlburt Field, Pararescue." A pause. "She goes by Shepard." Vega pulled out her tablet, opened a file, read for 30 seconds without expression. Reese kept working. She moved through the room in the pattern she had been maintaining for the last hour. Tension, pneumo patient, burn patient, laceration follow-ups, Harold Osei. Each one assessed, documented, noted. The room was winding down from acute phase to secondary care, but secondary care still needed doing, and she was the one doing it. Behind her, Vega was still reading. 3 combat deployments, Vega said. Not to Reese, specifically. To the room, the way a person reads something aloud when the weight of it requires some air around it. Purple Heart, Air Medal with Valor, Commendation Medal 2021, Combat Rescue Under Fire in Contested Terrain. The clinic floor had gone quiet in the specific way spaces go quiet, when something being said is changing the room's understanding of itself. Deja had stopped writing. Linda had stopped typing. Marcus, the orderly, had paused with a supply box in his arms and was looking at the triage lanes Reese had set up, looking at them differently than he had 20 minutes ago, recalibrating. Kessler looked up from her patient. Aldridge was at the entrance to the back hallway. His arms were at his sides. His coffee was in his hand. He was listening in the particular way of someone who would have preferred not to be hearing what he was hearing, but could not look away from it. The room waited. 11 confirmed saves on her final deployment. Vega continued, reading from the tablet. A pause. She resigned her commission 2 years ago. Honorable discharge. No forwarding address on file. She looked at Torres. 4 months at this clinic? Float nurse, Torres said. Nights. Vega set the tablet down. The triage floor Reese had built in 20 minutes from what a Southside community clinic had available. The tension pneumo patient breathing with both lungs. The side bay, empty now. With the notation on the whiteboard still in Reese's handwriting. Amara. Transferred. Stable. Or. Vega took all of it in without comment. Then she turned and looked at Aldridge. Her expression was entirely neutral. In Reese's experience, entirely neutral was the most alarming register available. You're the attending physician, Vega said. Aldridge stepped forward from the back hallway. Yes, Dr. Marcus Aldridge. I've been the attending here for 9 years. This clinic is the nearest medical facility to a 30-unit residential collapse. Vega's voice was level and unhurried. You received mass casualties tonight. We managed the situation effectively. The situation was managed by a former pararescueman working as a float nurse. Vega gestured at the floor. She set up triage lanes, performed a needle decompression, packed a pediatric penetrating abdominal injury with hemostatic gauze, and coordinated a mass casualty response using whatever this clinic had available. She paused. She did this without physician authorization. Aldridge looked at Reese, who did not look back. She performed procedures outside her scope of nursing practice, he said. There are liability. Dr. Aldridge. Vega's tone did not change, not a degree. A 9-year-old girl went to surgery with hemostatic packing correctly applied by this nurse. She is currently in stable condition at County General. If that packing had not been applied in the window it was applied, she would have bled out in your waiting room. The room was silent. Aldridge had nothing to say. I'm not here to audit your practice, Vega continued, but I would strongly encourage you to think carefully about the distinction between liability and accountability before you continue this line of thought. She turned back to her tablet. The room took a breath. Reese finished the secondary vitals round and moved to Earl Briggs's bay. His numbers had improved. MAP at 73, the best it had been all evening. His hands were less mottled, the purplish gray receding from the fingertips, replaced by something closer to the color of a body that had made a different decision about where to send its resources. He was sitting slightly more upright than before. Della had arrived 10 minutes ago. She was seated beside him with her coat still on and her hands around his, in the way of a woman who intended to hold them all the way to County General, and possibly beyond. She looked up when Reese came in. You're the one who called the transfer, she said. Yes. Linda said you flagged him twice before the doctor authorized it. Reese checked his blood pressure. 94/62. Marginal, but improved. He's doing better. How much better? Better enough that the transfer is going to work in his favor instead of against him. Della Briggs was 68 years old and had the directness of a woman who had long since stopped having time for anything that wasn't honest. She looked at Reese the way she might look at someone who had done something that didn't fit into an existing category. I don't know who you are, she said, but I'm glad you were here. I'm the float nurse, Reese said. Earl opened his eyes. He had been listening the whole time. She's more than that, he said. Reese checked his SAT. 93. Still moving up. Transfer team will be here in 8 minutes, she said. I'll be back before they arrive. She went back to the floor. Kessler was at the supply cart. She looked up when Reese approached. The shoulder reduction, Kessler said. External rotation at that angle. That's not standard civilian protocol. It's less traumatic to the surrounding tissue. I know. Where'd you learn it? Reese looked at her. Kessler nodded, not asking further. The triage setup is clean, she said. Whoever trained you did it right. They did, Reese said. They did it exactly right. She moved on. She passed the triage board on the way. 31 entries in her handwriting, time-stamped from 6:44 to 7:29 p.m. 45 minutes from the first blast response patient to the last triage assessment. 45 minutes was not a long time by any standard she had ever used. It had been long enough. Vega stopped her at the supply cart 20 minutes later. I'm not going to file anything tonight that complicates your employment, Vega said. For the record. I know you're not required to. No. But I wanted you to know directly. Vega studied her with the particular attention of someone making a decision about a person, not a situation. The protocols were correct. The decompression was correctly indicated. The pediatric packing was textbook. The triage setup was as good as anything I've seen in a field setting. A pause. You belong in that room. I work in that room, Reese said. You know what I mean. Reese looked at her evenly. I know what you mean, she said, and I'm not leaving. Vega looked at her for a moment longer. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, but adjusting. the colonel who had walked into a complicated situation and found it more complicated than expected, and had made her peace with that. "Good," she said. Then she nodded and went back to her after-action report. The transfer team for Earl Briggs arrived at 9:47. Reese gave the handoff in 30 seconds. Watched them load him and Della with the matter-of-fact efficiency of people who had done this procedure 1,000 times and still brought full attention to it. The ambulance pulled away from the clinic, turned the corner, and was gone. She stood at the door and listened to the sound of it diminishing. The sirens had mostly stopped. The smoke column was gone from the sky. The street was quiet in the specific way that disaster scenes went quiet in their second hour. Not calm, but temporarily still. The work shifted inside to the hospitals and the paperwork and the long aftermath. Behind her, the clinic hummed. In front of her, the south side was dark and cold and ongoing, the way it always was. She went back inside. The last acute patients were treated or transferred by 9:30. The triage lanes were still marked in moved chairs. Nobody had put them back. The IV carts, half depleted, had been pushed to the edges. The colored tape on the chartboard, red, yellow, green, the record of 31 people in 45 minutes, was still up. Torres was at the supply cart, restocking what they'd used, doing it correctly without being shown where anything was kept. Kessler was completing final assessments on the 2 remaining non-emergency patients. Aldridge's office door was almost but not entirely closed. Reese was restocking when Torres appeared at her shoulder. "County General called," he said quietly. She kept working. "Amara is out of surgery. The team said the packing was correctly applied and held throughout transport. She's stable. They expect a full recovery." Reese pressed a roll of gauze into the cart slot. "Good," she said. "It's more than good." "I know what it is." She pressed another roll in beside it. "I just need a minute before I let it be that." Torres said nothing. She finished the shelf, moved to the next. He waited. That was the thing about Torres. He had never required her to perform emotions on a schedule he set. He was patient in the way good operators were patient. Not passive, genuinely capable of waiting for the right moment without making the waiting into pressure. "Devon," she said after a while. "Yeah. His last transmission." Torres reached into the chest pocket of his plate carrier and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it toward her without ceremony. She unfolded it. Official comms transcript. AFSOCI header. The date and the time she had spent 3 years trying not to look at directly. At the bottom of the page, the last entry. 0411-58, Marsh, D, transmission, Shepherd. Not a call for help. Not a status report, or a location marker, or a request for extraction, or any of the transmissions she had spent 3 years hoping he had made. Just one word. Her call sign. Her name, in the only language they both spoke fluently. She folded the paper and held it with both hands for a long moment. Devon had known the math. He had always known the math. It was what made him good, the specific clarity that separated operators from people who wanted to be operators. The math had been clear, as clear as it had been on the LZ with the bird weighted and the window closing. She had taken her casualties, done her job exactly as trained. Devon had called her name, not because he needed saving, not because there was anything left to be done on that timeline, because she was the last thing worth saying. She put the paper in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. Torres nodded once. She went back to the floor. At 12:40, the final update from County General. Amara had been moved from recovery to the pediatric ward. Stable, alert, asking for her father, who had not left the building. At 1:15, the update on Earl Briggs. MAP stable at 78, cultures pending, sepsis protocol running. His hands, the notation said, were no longer mottled. She stood at the nurse's station with both notifications on her phone. She held the phone. Then she put it in her pocket and went back to the supply cart. Deja found her there. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When that man called your name." Deja was 22, 11 weeks into her career, and she would be measuring the rest of it against tonight. Reese could see that already. "Were you scared?" Reese thought about it. Not the performance of consideration, the actual consideration. "No," she said. "I've been scared here. Flagging charts that got crossed out. Watching patients deteriorate while the board stayed green. Knowing something was wrong and not being believed." She put a roll of gauze in its slot. "That was scary. Tonight?" She put another in beside it. "Tonight was the opposite of scared." Deja thought about that. What does the opposite of scared feel like? Reese pressed the last roll into place and closed the cart. "Useful," she said. Torres found her in the side bay. He came in and stood in the doorway with the quality of patience that was different from his earlier waiting. Less operational now, more personal. "The team is loading up," he said. "I know. I need to ask you one more time." She turned around. He was looking at her with less of his usual stillness and more of whatever lived underneath it. The scar through his left eyebrow caught the fluorescent light. "Devin called your name," he said. "His last transmission. He called you because you were the person he trusted most. That's not a debt you owe anyone. That's a fact about who you are." "I know that," she said. "Then come back," he said. "Not to the unit, not to the rank, just to doing the work at the level you're actually capable of doing it." He gestured at the room, the empty bay, the triage lanes visible through the door, the whiteboard with Amara's name still on it. "This is you at a fraction, and the world doesn't have enough of you at full." She looked at the exam table, at the dent in the paper lining where a 9-year-old girl had been laid down and then had gone on to remain alive, at the small stain Deja had missed when she cleaned, at the folded gauze wrapper in the corner. "I'm already here," she said. "I'm already doing the work." Torres waited. "I'm not coming back to the unit," she said, "but I'm not hiding anymore either." She looked at him directly. "This clinic is real. These patients are real. What I can do here is real." A pause. "Devin would say that's the math." Torres looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He reached into his cargo pocket and set something on the exam table without making a production of it, a small patch, subdued colors, PJ insignia, the motto in letters she could read without looking, that others may live. "You lived up to it tonight," he said. He left. She heard his footsteps cross the waiting room, the front door, the vehicles starting up, one by one, and pulling away from the curb into the dark. She stood in the empty side bay. She held the patch and looked at the motto for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket alongside the comms transcript. Devin's call sign for her. The motto between them, all of it, carried. She walked back to the floor. Aldridge's office door was open. He was at his desk, a chart in both hands. Earl Briggs's chart. She recognized the tab. He was looking at the nursing notes, her notes, the flag she had written and he had crossed out, and then the orders she had written without authorization, and then the IV placement notation, and then the blood draw times, all of it in her handwriting from 6 hours ago. He did not look up when she passed, but on the desk, beside the chart, his pen was in his hand. She slowed without stopping. The cross-out on her first flag, the line he had drawn through her initial sepsis notation 6 hours ago, had been overwritten, not erased. He had drawn a single stroke over it in the opposite direction, converting a cancellation into a correction. One stroke. It was small. It was not nothing. She kept walking. Linda was at the desk. Deja was restocking. The two remaining patients sat near the window with paperwork on their laps and the exhausted, slightly unfocused expressions of people who had been through something they would be processing for weeks. The fluorescent lights hummed. She stood in the center of the floor and let it settle over her. Not the adrenaline, not the accounting, just the room. The specific, ordinary, particular texture of a Southside clinic at 10 on a November night, with the crisis behind it and the next shift a few hours out. 4 months of trying to be invisible. 1 night of being impossible to miss. Deja appeared at her shoulder. "Is there anything you need?" "No." Reese picked up the nearest chart. "Get some water. It's been a long shift." "It's been a long shift for you too." "I know." She looked at the chart. New patient. Non-urgent. Exactly the kind of patient she had spent 4 months handling with perfect invisibility. "I'm fine." She went to the bay. The south side stopped burning before midnight. St. Catherine's Community Clinic settled back into its register. The intake queue, the patient board filling and clearing, the perpetual work of a neighborhood that had too many needs and too few places to put them. She worked the rest of the shift the way she always had. Efficient, thorough, the kind of thorough that got called excessive by people who hadn't yet needed it. Vitals checked. She changed dressings. She flagged 2 charts for physician review and walked them to Aldridge's desk personally. He read them without comment. He initialed them without overwriting her notes. Near midnight, she passed the triage lanes she had set up. They were still there. Nobody had moved the chairs. The colored tape on the patient's wristbands was still on the intake board. She left them where they were. For 4 months she had not wanted to be seen. Coming here specifically to disappear into the gaps, to be the float who filled the holes and left no mark. The triage lanes were a mark. The IV carts labeled in her handwriting were a mark. The child alive in the pediatric ward at County General was a mark. Devon's name on a comms transcript was a mark. Not a wound anymore, but a record. The record of a person who had trusted her completely and had been right to. The fluorescent lights hummed at the frequency she had almost learned to ignore. Almost. Not quite. For the first time in 4 months, she did not want to ignore it. She wanted to hear it exactly as it was. The specific note of a specific place that needed specific things she happened to have. Not despite what she had been through. Because of it. Devon would say that was the math. The math had never stopped being true. Reese picked up the next chart and got back to work.